Roman Empire celebrated for its unmatched power, its dazzling architecture, and its military conquests that stretched across continents. But beneath the glory of marble temples and triumphal processions lies a much darker history, a story rarely told, one that whispers from the margins of ancient texts, the suffering of women who became concubines to Rome's most powerful commanders. These women were not celebrated. They were not honored. They were trophies, taken from conquered lands, stripped of identity, and forced into lives where obedience was demanded and cruelty was routine. The empire that prided itself on discipline and law gave no justice to these women. Instead, they became the silent victims of power. And today, we are going to pull back that curtain. We will uncover the most horrifying acts Roman commanders inflicted upon their concubines, acts that reveal the brutal reality behind Rome's greatness. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay connected with more untold stories from history. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to know. And as we go through this story, share your thoughts. Do you think Rome's glory outweighs its cruelty? To understand their suffering, we need to begin with who concubines were in Roman society. Unlike wives, who held legal standing, or slaves, who were laborers, concubines were in a strange and powerless category. They were often taken during war campaigns. When Roman legions swept through Greece, Gaul, Judea, or Egypt, they didn't just seize land and treasure. They also captured people, especially young women. Commanders chose the most beautiful and spirited among them, parading them as spoils of war. These women were not asked if they wanted this role. They were forced into it. A concubine's purpose was simple: to serve her master's physical desires and, at times, to bear his children. On paper, Roman law treated concubinage as a recognized relationship. Unlike prostitutes, concubines had a semi-official status. But in practice, this did not protect them. They could be dismissed at any time. They could be beaten, humiliated, or even killed without repercussion. Their fate depended entirely on the moods and whims of the commander who owned them. Imagine this: a woman taken from her homeland, her family either killed or sold away, suddenly forced to live inside the household of the very man who destroyed her world. She is given fine clothes, maybe even jewelry, but every step she takes, every word she speaks, must conform to his desires. Her life is no longer her own. Roman commanders didn't see concubines as human beings. They saw them as symbols of triumph. Each concubine was proof of their victories. A Greek historian once wrote that during victory processions, generals would sometimes march their women captives alongside their treasures, as if both were of equal value. Inside private chambers, the same logic applied. Commanders believed they had earned absolute control. Their authority in war extended into their personal lives, and the concubine was simply another extension of conquest. This mindset created an environment where cruelty was not only tolerated but encouraged. If a concubine disobeyed, she was punished, sometimes brutally, sometimes publicly. Her suffering reminded others of the commander's power. At first glance, concubines lived better than ordinary slaves. They were often clothed in silk, fed the finest meals, and kept in lavish quarters. But this was only an illusion. The luxury was a gilded cage, designed not for comfort but for control. Why give them such luxury? Because it displayed the wealth and status of the commander. Guests could look upon these women and marvel at their beauty and elegance, never realizing the fear and sorrow hidden behind their eyes. The concubine's beauty was a weapon used to elevate her master's prestige. But luxury came with constant surveillance. These women were watched, guarded, and isolated. They could not leave the commander's home. They could not write letters to their families, or even speak their native tongues openly. Every part of their lives was orchestrated to remind them of their dependence. One of the darkest realities recorded in Roman sources is the way concubines were used for entertainment. Ancient writers describe scenes at banquets where generals would parade their concubines before guests. Sometimes they were forced to dance, sing, or play instruments. Other times they were humiliated, made to perform degrading acts while soldiers and officials laughed. Tacitus, a Roman historian, mentions commanders who deliberately showcased the vulnerability of their women captives. By humiliating them publicly, commanders reinforced the image of Rome's absolute dominance. The cruelty was not random. It was psychological warfare. These humiliations broke the spirit of concubines, erasing any hope of dignity. And for the commander, it was a performance of power. Perhaps the deepest wound inflicted on concubines was the erasure of identity. Women were often renamed by their commanders, stripped of the names given by their families. They were forbidden to practice their religions, to keep their cultural traditions, or even to speak of their homelands. This was not just control. It was the destruction of self. Over time, concubines became shadows of who they once were, forced to live only as extensions of their masters. The suffering of concubines did not end with their loss of freedom. For many, the true nightmare began once they entered the world of Roman commanders, where cruelty was masked as authority and violence was considered a natural extension of conquest. Within the walls of grand villas and military encampments, punishments became a daily reality, each act a reminder that these women were not wives, not partners, but property. Ancient records suggest that commanders often enforced obedience through fear. A concubine who resisted advances, or even displayed sadness, could be whipped before servants. Whippings were not carried out in private, but often in front of others to humiliate the victim and remind everyone present that disobedience carried consequences. The lash of the whip across her back was meant not just to cause pain, but to break her spirit, to silence any thought of resistance. Roman society saw this violence as discipline, no different than a soldier being punished for failing his duty. But for the concubine, whose only crime was existing at the mercy of her master, it was relentless torment. There are accounts from historians like Suetonius that describe generals who devised cruel games with their concubines. At feasts, they would force women to serve wine to soldiers while wearing revealing or degrading outfits, ensuring their humiliation in front of dozens of drunken men. Some commanders would go further, ordering their concubines to sing or act out lewd scenes for entertainment, laughing as the women fought back tears. The more a woman resisted, the harsher the punishments afterward. Punishment was not always physical. Psychological torment was a favored weapon. Many concubines were forced to witness executions of fellow captives, sometimes women they had known in their homeland. This was a deliberate tactic. By seeing death firsthand, they would understand that disobedience could mean the same fate. For a young woman stolen from her home, surrounded by strangers speaking a foreign tongue, such experiences created a constant state of terror. Sleep brought little comfort because nightmares often blended with the waking horror of her life. In some cases, commanders used starvation or isolation as tools of control. A concubine who displeased her master could be locked away for days without food or water, left to weaken physically and mentally before being brought back into service. Others were forced to remain silent during banquets, standing like statues for hours, unable to move or speak until their master allowed it. The intent was always the same: to remind them that every aspect of their existence depended on the commander's will. Sexual violence was, of course, at the center of their suffering. These women had no right to refuse. Their bodies were considered rewards of war, to be used at any time, in any manner. But what made this cruelty even worse was that it was often performed in ways designed to degrade, not just to satisfy. Commanders sometimes summoned their officers to witness these acts, treating the concubine as a display of power. It was not intimacy, It was domination, a staged performance to show that even human beings could be conquered like territories. Some commanders went further still, using concubines as instruments of political games. A woman could be handed over to soldiers as a gift for loyalty, traded to allies, or discarded when no longer considered beautiful or useful. Imagine the horror of being treated as currency, passed from one man to another with no say in the matter. For many concubines, there was no stability, no single master to serve. They could be uprooted again and again, each new owner bringing fresh humiliations. The brutality also extended to pregnancies. If a concubine became pregnant, the outcome depended on the commander's desires. Some generals wanted children, seeing them as heirs or symbols of virility. Others saw pregnancies as inconveniences. In such cases, concubines were forced into dangerous abortions, or the child was abandoned at birth. The mother's grief had no place in the commander's calculations. In a world where women were already treated as expendable, unborn children became collateral damage. Even moments that seemed merciful often carried cruelty beneath the surface. For example, some commanders gave concubines fine clothes and jewels, not as kindness but as tools of display. Guests might see the women adorned like queens, yet those same women knew that a single mistake could strip them of everything in an instant. The jewels were not gifts, they were chains in disguise, keeping them tied to a life of servitude. One of the most disturbing aspects was how normalized this cruelty became. Roman culture, built on conquest, taught its leaders that domination was a virtue. To control land was to gain power, and to control people was no different. Concubines, therefore, became an extension of that philosophy. A commander who displayed mercy might be seen as weak, while one who enforced terror gained respect from his peers. For the women trapped in this system, it meant that hope was almost impossible. They could not appeal to law, for the law did not recognize them as victims. They could not seek escape, for guards and soldiers stood at every gate. Their suffering remained invisible to the world outside. Some sources suggest that, on rare occasions, concubines did attempt to resist. A few took their own lives rather than endure the torment. Others tried to escape, but the punishment for capture was often public and brutal. Such events served as warnings to the others. Survival required silence and submission. In this way, the cycle of abuse continued unbroken, generation after generation, as Rome expanded its empire and brought more women under the same fate. By the time Rome reached its height, concubinage was not just a practice, it was an institution. It was woven into the fabric of military life, normalized to the point that few questioned its morality. Yet behind the polished marble of villas and the splendor of victory parades, countless women lived lives of misery, their voices silenced by fear. The commanders who led armies to conquer nations also conquered human souls, leaving scars that history has too often ignored. Their punishments, their humiliations, their suffering, these were not isolated incidents but the daily reality of concubines trapped under Roman command. And while the empire celebrated its victories, these women endured battles of their own, fought not with swords or shields, but with the fragile hope of survival in a world that denied them dignity. The cruelty of Roman commanders was not always marked by whips or chains. Sometimes it came in the form of silks, jewels, and gilded halls. To outsiders, concubines appeared to live lives of privilege. They wore the finest clothing, ate the richest foods, and were sheltered in luxurious rooms. But this splendor was never meant to bring comfort. It was a mask, carefully designed to make their captivity appear desirable while concealing the suffering within. The luxury was not freedom, it was a prison wrapped in gold. Commanders understood that control did not always require violence. True power lay in convincing someone that resistance was useless. Concubines were often told that they should be grateful, that their condition was better than that of slaves laboring in fields or soldiers dying on the battlefield. This false comparison was repeated until some began to accept it, not because they believed it, but because hope of escape seemed impossible. The jewels around their necks and the silks on their bodies were chains of another kind, reminders that their lives were shaped by the whims of the man who owned them. Banquets and gatherings exposed this contradiction most clearly. A concubine might enter a hall adorned like a queen, her hair styled with gold pins, her robes shimmering with dyes worth fortunes. Yet she was not a guest at the table, but part of the spectacle. She might pour wine for the commander's allies, forced to smile as men praised her beauty while mocking her silence. At times she was ordered to sing, to dance, or to play instruments, not as entertainment born of joy, but as a performance demanded under threat. The applause of drunken men was not admiration. It was another form of humiliation. The psychological games extended beyond appearances. Commanders often alternated between cruelty and gestures of affection, keeping concubines in a state of confusion. A woman might be beaten one day for speaking without permission, only to be showered with gifts the next. This deliberate inconsistency ensured that she never felt secure, never knew which version of her master she would face. The unpredictability itself was a form of torment, preventing her from finding stability even in her suffering. In some cases, commanders played concubines against one another. A household with several concubines became a theater of jealousy and rivalry, carefully orchestrated by the man in power. He might favor one woman with jewelry while ignoring another, or whisper promises of affection to one while punishing another harshly. These divisions kept the women isolated, unable to form alliances or support each other. Each concubine learned that survival meant pleasing the master, even if it meant stepping on the dignity of another. There were also times when concubines were paraded outside the private walls, used as symbols in the public eye. Some commanders took their concubines to theaters, races, or military camps, not to grant them enjoyment, but to show others the scope of their dominance. A beautiful woman by a commander's side was not a partner. It was a display, a statement that he had conquered both lands and bodies. The concubine herself had no choice in these appearances. She was told how to dress, how to smile, how to behave, all while the commander basked in admiration for his possession. The contradiction of their existence was unbearable. They lived in wealth, yet knew they could be discarded at any moment. Some were dismissed when they aged or when their beauty faded, replaced by younger captives from new campaigns. Dismissal did not mean freedom. It often meant being sold into harsher slavery or passed to lower-ranking officers. What had once been called privilege vanished instantly, revealing the fragility of their supposed status. The fear of replacement haunted concubines daily. Each new war campaign brought fresh captives, and with them the possibility of being abandoned. Women who had endured years of suffering could be discarded without a second thought, their loyalty meaningless in the eyes of commanders. This uncertainty was another form of punishment. It ensured that even those who endured cruelty in silence could never feel secure. Some commanders disguised cruelty as games, pretending to offer freedom as a prize only to snatch it away. Stories survive of women being told they would be set free if they performed some act of loyalty or obedience, only for the promise to be broken. Such deceit was not only an abuse of power, but a calculated way to crush hope itself. Once hope was extinguished, the concubine's spirit could be bent to any command. The role of concubines in Roman society also reinforced the empire's brutal values. Just as soldiers conquered foreign lands, so too did commanders conquer women, turning them into living emblems of victory. The concubine's suffering was not incidental. It was essential to the image of dominance. Every act of cruelty reaffirmed the hierarchy. Rome above all, commanders above the conquered, and women at the very bottom. Their misery was proof of Rome's strength. There were rare instances where concubines bore children, and here too the cruelty of commanders revealed itself. Some men accepted these children, parading them as symbols of virility. Others saw them as inconvenient reminders of human vulnerability, and ordered them discarded. A mother forced to give up her child endured a grief far worse than any physical beating. Yet her cries went unheard, for her voice carried no weight in the halls of power. For the concubines themselves, survival often meant living two lives at once. On the surface, they played the role demanded of them, silent, obedient, adorned like treasures. But within, they clung to fragments of memory, the sound of their native tongue, the face of a lost sibling, the smell of the land they once called home. These memories became their only refuge, a small space untouched by Roman cruelty. Yet even memory was dangerous, for if they showed longing for their past, it could be punished as defiance. And so they learned to bury everything that made them human. They smiled when told. They obeyed without hesitation. They silenced their grief. This erasure of self was perhaps the greatest cruelty of all, because it ensured that long before their bodies grew old, their identities had already been destroyed. They became ghosts within gilded walls, alive but unseen, existing only as reflections of the men who owned them. By the height of Rome's power, this system was so deeply ingrained that few questioned it. To many Romans, the concubines' suffering was invisible, hidden beneath the spectacle of wealth and victory. But if one looks closely at the cracks in ancient accounts, the truth becomes clear. The empire that built aqueducts and roads with discipline also built cages of silk and gold, in which countless women suffered lives of unending torment. The deeper we look into Rome's history, the more disturbing the accounts become. What concubines endured was not simply private cruelty hidden within villas and encampments. Sometimes their suffering was dragged into the public eye, turned into a grotesque spectacle to entertain soldiers or demonstrate authority. Violence was not just a method of control. It became a form of theater, a chilling reminder that even human pain could be used as a tool of power. Some commanders forced concubines to participate in banquets not only as servants but as objects of mockery. During feasts, women might be stripped of their dignity before drunken crowds, commanded to serve food while enduring insults and laughter. Soldiers would cheer as their general staged humiliations, turning what should have been moments of hospitality into cruel demonstrations of dominance. In some cases, concubines were made to reenact scenes of conquest, playing the roles of conquered peoples while their commanders played the triumphant Romans. These performances reduced women to living symbols of defeat, ensuring that their humiliation was etched into memory. But cruelty did not stop at humiliation. There are accounts of commanders using violence as a warning, not only against their concubines, but against anyone who might question their authority. Concubines could be beaten for trivial reasons, looking away when spoken to, showing signs of sorrow, or even being slow to obey an order. What made these punishments even more horrific was their often public nature. Soldiers might be gathered to watch as a concubine was whipped or struck down, the display intended to remind everyone of the commander's absolute control. Some concubines were subjected to punishments designed to erase any sense of identity. A woman might be forced to wear clothing that mocked her heritage, or she might be branded with marks that labeled her as property. The Romans prided themselves on discipline and law, but for these women there was no protection. To be owned by a commander was to exist outside the bounds of justice. Her suffering was his right, her body his possession, her life his to decide. Perhaps the most horrifying accounts describe concubines being forced into the cruel games of Roman soldiers. During long campaigns, when boredom spread through camps, commanders sometimes allowed their men to vent frustrations on captives. A concubine might be made to dance for the amusement of troops or endure taunts from hundreds of eyes. In darker moments, commanders handed women over to soldiers as rewards, stripping them not only of dignity but of any illusion of safety. What should have been a private torment became a collective violence, leaving scars that no one bothered to record. The connection between violence and entertainment was especially clear in Rome's culture of spectacle. Gladiatorial games were built on blood and cruelty, and in smaller, hidden spaces, concubines suffered in similar ways. Some commanders staged brutal contests in their own households, forcing concubines to fight one another or to perform degrading tasks while guests laughed. These acts blurred the line between private abuse and public performance, turning suffering into a form of leisure. For the women trapped in these games, there was no victory, only survival from one moment to the next. Pregnancy brought its own horrors. While some commanders embraced children born of concubines, others saw them as threats or inconveniences. There are chilling stories of infants abandoned or quietly killed, erasing not only the future of the child but deepening the despair of the mother. For a concubine, bearing a child did not mean hope, it meant risk. She might be discarded for her inability to continue pleasing her master, or she might live with the constant fear that the child she carried would not be allowed to live. The cruelty extended beyond the woman herself, cutting into the very possibility of life. The most brutal commanders went further still, using execution as the ultimate tool of terror. A concubine who was accused of betrayal, whether true or imagined, might be put to death in front of others. Some were strangled, others beaten, and still others killed in ways meant to shock and intimidate. These deaths were not only punishments for the individual woman, but warnings to every captive who remained alive. The message was clear. The commander's authority was absolute, and mercy was not to be expected. Even in death, concubines were denied dignity. Unlike Roman wives or noblewomen, who were given burials with rites and remembrance, concubines who perished often vanished into anonymity. Their bodies could be discarded without ceremony, their names unrecorded. In this way, commanders ensured that even memory itself was denied to them. Their stories lived only in fragments, in the whispers of historians or the rare accounts that slipped through the cracks of official history. What makes these horrors even more chilling is how normalized they became within Roman society. Commanders who committed such acts were not condemned. In many cases, they were celebrated for their strength and discipline. Rome's culture of conquest had little room for pity. Women taken as concubines were seen as part of the spoils of war, no different than gold, weapons, or livestock. Their suffering was invisible in the grand narratives of Roman glory. Yet behind every victory parade, every triumphal march, there were women weeping in silence. While soldiers carried banners and commanders basked in adoration, concubines endured punishments that robbed them of identity, dignity, and life itself. Their pain was hidden behind the noise of celebration, their voices drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. The terrifying reality of their existence reminds us that Rome's greatness came at a cost measured not only in blood spilled on battlefields, but in the unseen suffering of women forced into servitude. These concubines, trapped in gilded cages and subjected to unimaginable cruelties, represent a side of history too often forgotten. They lived and died as possessions, reminders that power unchecked breeds horrors that echo long after empires fall. When we look back at Rome, we often remember the victories, the grand architecture, and the emperors who left their mark on history. We admire the aqueducts that still stand, the roads that stretched across continents, the laws that influenced later civilizations. But hidden behind this glory is a silence that has lasted for centuries, the silence of women who endured lives of unimaginable cruelty. The concubines of Roman commanders were among the most voiceless of all, trapped in a world that denied them justice and erased their stories from the record. Historians wrote about the triumphs of generals, but rarely about the women taken as spoils. The fragments we do have, accounts from writers like Tacitus or Suetonius, are small windows into a reality that must have been far larger, far darker. For every concubine mentioned by name, countless others were forgotten. Their lives ended in anonymity, their stories swallowed by the empire that enslaved them. This erasure was not accidental. It was deliberate. Rome celebrated power, not suffering. To preserve the image of the empire, the voices of concubines had to be silenced. What makes this silence even more haunting is that many concubines were never given the chance to tell their own stories. They lived in households where their every word was controlled, their identities erased, their past lives forgotten. By the time they died, often young, there was nothing left to remember them by. No graves with names, no poems, no family lines to carry on their memory. The empire that built monuments to its victories left nothing for them. They were, in the eyes of Rome, invisible. Yet invisibility does not mean they did not exist. Their suffering was real, their tears fell, their fears consumed them night after night. And though history tried to bury their voices, we can still uncover their truth by reading between the lines. Each cruel story preserved by Roman writers, though written without sympathy, allows us to glimpse the reality these women endured. The fact that concubinage existed, that it was normalized, that it was accepted as part of Rome's order. All of this tells us enough about the hidden cost of empire. The legacy of concubines is also a lesson about power itself. Rome believed it had the right to conquer, to enslave, to take lives and bodies without question. Commanders saw their concubines as extensions of their victories, proof that their authority was limitless. But absolute power is never without consequence. The cruelty inflicted on concubines shows us what happens when human beings are stripped of dignity, when suffering is ignored, when conquest is celebrated without considering those who pay the price. These women did not choose their fate. They did not choose to be taken from their homes, paraded as trophies, humiliated in public, punished for imagined crimes, or forced into submission. They were victims of a system that glorified dominance and erased compassion. Their stories remind us that history is not only written by victors, but shaped by what victors choose to omit. To understand Rome fully, we must not only admire its achievements, but confront its cruelties. In remembering the concubines, we restore part of the humanity Rome tried to erase. We give voice to the silenced, dignity to the forgotten, and we remind ourselves that every empire, no matter how powerful, carries within it the weight of the suffering it caused. Rome may have conquered vast lands, but it also conquered countless women, turning their lives into instruments of power. Their pain, though hidden, is part of Rome's legacy just as much as its triumphs. The silence surrounding concubines also forces us to ask a deeper question. How many voices in history have been lost in the same way? For every emperor whose name is etched in stone, there are thousands of nameless women whose lives were stolen, whose stories were erased. Their invisibility is a reminder that history is not complete until we seek out the voices of those who could not speak for themselves. For the concubines, memory is the only justice left. By telling their story today, we resist the erasure Rome imposed. We remind the world that behind the shining marble and triumphant marches were women crying in the shadows, women who endured unspeakable acts yet never had the chance to be heard. Their suffering does not fade simply because it was ignored. It becomes even more important to remember because of that silence. In the end, Rome fell, as all empires do. Its generals died, its emperors lost their thrones, its monuments crumbled. But the suffering of concubines remains etched into the hidden corners of its history. Though nameless, though voiceless, their stories carry weight even now. They teach us that cruelty disguised as glory is not greatness, it is tragedy, and by remembering them, we strip away the illusion of Rome's perfection and reveal the human cost of its rise. So as we close this story, reflect on the voices we never got to hear. Imagine the countless women who lived in fear, who endured punishments, who bore children only to lose them, who looked at the sky and longed for homes they would never see again. They are the invisible witnesses of Rome's empire, and their memory deserves to be honored. Rome gave us many things: roads, laws, literature, architecture, but it also left behind a trail of broken lives. To understand the empire fully, we must remember both. We must remember the glory, but also the horror. The concubines remind us that history is not only about what was built, but also about what was destroyed. Their suffering is not a footnote, it is a central part of the story. And so, when we speak of Rome, we must also speak of them. The women who lived in shadows, who endured the worst acts of power, and who remind us that behind every empire's greatness lies a cost paid in human pain. They cannot speak for themselves, but through history, through reflection, and through remembrance, we can ensure they are not forgotten. This has been the story of the concubines of Rome, their suffering, their silence, their legacy. If you are watching this, let it not just be history you hear, but a memory you carry. Because to remember them is to honor them, and to honor them is to finally break the silence Rome imposed so long ago.